Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar number 9 of the Zero Emission Buildings Academy, organized in partnership between the European Copper Institute, the Building Performance Institute Europe, and the European Construction Technology Platform. So the aim of this academy is to share information, best practices, and knowledge about how to reach a zero-emission building stocks to help everyone working on this at EU or national level or in other countries to progress. And today is an important one because we will discuss the new Buildings Directive, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive that is close to be finalized. So it's not a final text fully adopted yet, but we have a deal between the different institutions at EU level reached in December, 2 years after the proposal made by the Commission. And this directive will be very important to move the building stock to zero emission. And for this, I'm very glad to welcome two key persons in all this process. So we have first Thomas Baines, who is the parliamentary assistant to the Irish MEP Karen Cuff, who was the rapporteur on the Epbd for the group of the Greens EFA. So Thomas has been very active on the Epbd the last 2 years, and is also shortlisted as nominee for the accredited Parliament assistant of the mandate. And I think it is a lot related to the intensive work he did on the Epbd. So welcome, Thomas. And then we have Stefan Moser, who is head of unit for the unit building and products at DG Energy. So that's the unit who has worked on the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. Stefan joined the Commission in the year 2000 already. He's head of unit at DG NR since 2015, first on the for the security of supply unit, and then for the unit energy efficiency of buildings and products. And having efficient buildings is also helping for the security of supply. So all of this is connected. So welcome, Stefan. So our topic today is the the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. And to start the discussion, I will ask simply to Thomas to tell us why is this directive important for the European Parliament and for Karen Cuff, MEP. Thomas.
Well, thank you very much, Canton, and thank you very much for the kind introduction. Before I get started, let me convey the apologies of Mr. Kieran Cuff. Unfortunately, he is in Dublin at the moment. Unfortunately, the parliamentary work in Brussels is somewhat slowing down a bit. We have one more vote to get through, as I'm sure most of you are aware. But between that, he this week, unfortunately, is in Dublin, so he can't make it. So you'll have to make do with me for the time being. But yeah, to move on to the question asked, I think from the Parliament's perspective, the revision of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive came in line with the Green Deal. This was the obligation now that the European Union has, that it would be the first climate neutral continent by 2050. To implement this, the Commission put forward the Fit for 55 package, and as part of that, the revision of the Epbd. So I think in the Commission's original proposal, it had given us quite a good outline on given us the first steps on how we should get to 2050 and the goal of a carbon neutral building stock. From the Parliament's perspective, and I think I can speak on behalf of Mr. Cuff here, I could say that as we moved the legislation forward, we had three broad priorities. So the first one was reducing emissions. Naturally, this was in line with the EU's overall goal of reducing emissions completely and becoming climate neutral by 2050. So why would we do this for buildings? The simple fact is that 30% of greenhouse gas emissions in Europe come from buildings, and 40% of the energy used in the EU is used to power buildings. From our perspective, we felt that this revision was a huge opportunity whereby we could cut those numbers and really lead us on a way that we could actually have a climate neutral building stock before 2050. When it came to reducing emissions, Mr. Cuff wanted to be as ambitious as possible, excuse me. As well as that, if you remember, it's 2 years ago now, but this is when we were just drafting the draft report in the European Parliament. We had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the Repower EU's package was the Commission's response to that, and that set out the legislative and the policy goal of becoming or ending our reliance on Russia for energy. So again, we felt that our directive was a huge opportunity for us to contribute to that policy goals. So as a result, and Stefan will tell you more about this later, we now had a article in the directive that would lead to increased solar rooftop energy in buildings. For Mr. Cuff, this was a no-brainer. I think he often quotes a study that says that if we had started mandating solar on buildings in the year 2000, the energy crisis now wouldn't have happened. Our reliance on fossil fuels could have been ended a lot sooner. But that was one of the priorities, reducing emissions. The second one was social improvement. From our perspective, this directive was an opportunity to also tackle social policy. So when you renovate a building, you're making that more energy efficient. So that means and when a building is more energy efficient, it means the person inside that is paying less money on their bills. For us, this was really, really important, and the Commission started in its proposal with the idea of renovating the worst performing buildings. For us, this was the correct approach to go with, because the people who end up spending the most amount of money on their bills live in the worst performing buildings. So we felt that this would not only improve the quality of life of people living in the worst performing buildings, but it would also improve their comfort, their air quality, and allow them to transition to cleaner sources of energy. So for us, that was hugely important. It also helped us fight what we call energy poverty. So this would enable people who are struggling to pay their energy bills. This would eliminate that concern from their lives, or so we had thought. So in the Parliament's position, this is why we had, I think we had put in quite a lot more language on social safeguards when it came to renovation, increased financing for vulnerable households. For us, this was really important, and it was our second priority. And our third priority was stimulating investment in green jobs. So from certainly an Irish perspective, I can say we have a saying that when there's plenty of construction cranes in the sky in Dublin, that means the economy is going well. So we felt that this revision would really give us the opportunity to inject a boost into the construction industry and facilitate the transition towards greener jobs. We're acutely aware that reskilling in green areas, in renewable technology, and also just in the renovation sector was something that we'd have to address, and it's something that we're happy we were able to get more financing for. But that was the third area. I don't need to talk to a lot of the participants here about the benefits of smart technologies in buildings, such as VACs, smart meters, etc. We really felt that this was a good opportunity for us to give that industry a bit more of a kickstart, whereby we could create more investments into those jobs here in Europe. So very briefly, Canton, I'll leave it there. That was just going into the process. That was our three priorities. I'd like to say that they stayed constant throughout. I don't know whether or not we fulfilled them as much as we'd like throughout the negotiation process, but indeed, that's politics, and that's the legislative the legislative process that we have in Europe. But nonetheless, I do think that this legislation, once enacted, will fulfill those three priorities that we had, which are reducing emissions, improving social conditions in buildings, and stimulating investments in green jobs. But I'll just leave it there as the broad political overview, and I hope this this legislation, when it's enacted, is really the first step to seeing ourselves hitting a carbon neutral building stock by 2050. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. So yes, reducing emission and ending our reliance on fossil energy imported, improving social conditions and deploying green jobs. So 3 key important priorities in the revision of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive from your point of view. Stefan, on the Commission side, so the general objectives of the directive now and what is achieved with the revision.
Thanks a lot, Quentin. To you, your colleagues, Thomas, and many thanks for the very good cooperation along the way with, of course, the negotiators from the other institutions, from the Parliament and the Council, but also all the stakeholders who have contributed very intensively. I think the general objectives were outlined by Thomas. I think what we from the Commission side would also like to emphasize is bringing together basically sustainability, decarbonization with energy security, and achieving also the competitiveness of industry, predictability, and investment framework to rely on, putting renovations on a predictable pathway towards 2050 for both investments by economic operators, but also the training institutions for workers and young people to have a clear perspective, how much is needed, how many people are needed, what skills are needed to bring together basically the different constraints on a planning pathway basically, so that there's a reference framework. I think that is also very important. To avoid that investments would be frustrated, stranded, that young people, when they enter the sector, will have a perspective at least of remaining employed, that there's enough work to be done to avoid disappointments, basically. I think that is very important from our point of view. So to make basically the different ends meet of the various objectives, economy, sustainability, but also security. As you said, getting out of fossil fuels, not only for decarbonization and sustainability, but also simply reducing the dependence of Europe as a continent on others, on imports in particular. So that I think is very important.
Thank you. So indeed, predictability, having the framework in place, and that's also the occasion to remind it it's a directive, so member states will have to implement. So it's setting the framework for what member states will do in the next step. So let's go through the framework now that the directive is defining, and let's start maybe with the easy part. That's for new buildings. So what is now required for new buildings?
So new buildings indeed are the easier part of it, as you've just said, because the new technologies can be put to full use. So the idea is really to avoid on-site emissions, to have zero on-site emissions from fossil fuels as of certain dates, which is 2028 for public buildings and 2030 for all buildings. To basically implement the so-called zero-emission building standard, which defines what is a zero-emission building. A zero-emission building is not a building which would use zero energy. So it is a building which uses little energy, so very low amounts of energy, and the remaining energy needs would be covered by zero-emission sources, notably renewable energy, but not only, of course. And that is to some extent an optimization. So it's not necessarily the same result everywhere. So the same building would not be the optimal building in all parts of Europe or the world, or even inside one country. It depends on the climate zone, on what exactly are the requirements and the availability, for instance, also of renewable energy on site. And that would then determine the optimal outcome between the energy needs of the building and actually the provision of zero emission energy to that building. And priority, I would say, is to avoid zero to avoid fossil fuel emissions on site. So really to bring it down as a building, to supply energy as zero emission energy basically from the grid where needed. Otherwise, even prioritize the production of renewable energy on site, for instance, solar rooftops as the most as a very important application, but also, of course, district heating, geothermal, whatever sources are close by and can be used in that respect.
Thank you. So very clear. We move from nearly zero energy to zero emission buildings now with a clear timeline. Public buildings starting first, and it means no fossil on site. But we know the biggest challenge is the renovation, and so that's a big objective of the directive as well. And then for renovation, you have defined some pathways, and we need there to distinguish non-residential and residential.
Indeed. So the challenge is with the existing building stock to make it possible, basically, not to overburden society, to have basically a reasonable pathway towards 2050. And that was actually the challenge for the co-legislators to set that pathway. Member states will be in the driving seat in terms of determining which buildings, also the renovation priorities within certain constraints, which were put in the directive for residential buildings. As Thomas has outlined, there should be a focus on the worst performing buildings for two very good reasons. One is actually their investments pay off the most, where you have the biggest gains to make, where you get the most out of your money basically for the investments, but also where the biggest broader benefits for society, notably because in worst performing buildings, usually you have the most vulnerable citizens, which need most an improvement of their living conditions. So it's basically there where social policy and climate, environment, but also economic policy flow together, where there's a win-win basically for society and also for the people living in those buildings. And there, in the legal text, it has been stated that at least more than half, 55% at least, of the decrease of the primary energy use is achieved through the renovation of the worst performing buildings. And worst performing buildings are, I would say, the lowest third, lowest half of the building stock. 43% was mentioned here as determining where one should identify the worst performing buildings. But what is important is that this gives the range for the member state to choose. So it's not that every building will have to be renovated. There can be priorities set. There can be a choice by the member states to on the intensity of renovations, either to renovate across the board as many buildings as possible with a lower intensity approach, or certain interventions which are prioritized, for instance, insulations of the facade as an example only, or whether to concentrate the available means, the investments which are possible within a certain time period on a reduced number of buildings, but then very intensively. So that is basically a choice for the member states to make based on an assessment of the individual buildings, basically of the typologies, but then also of individual buildings where you need also a very, I would say, strong involvement of the municipal level, of the city level, to combine that with urban planning and where are the priorities, where it's most needed and most useful for society. So that is for the residential buildings. There are no, I would say, direct renovation obligations for individual homeowners from the directive. That is very important. So it's the member states who define their priorities, and they have also a choice to make on the tools, what to use, how to actually make sure that individual citizens can and will renovate. They can, of course, work with incentives, with information measures, with advice, and they can, of course, also regulatory measures defined by the member states. But it does not come directly from the directive, from the EU level. And the trajectory basically is basically what I would say has been considered by the co-legislated to be the feasible pathway towards 2050. 2050 is the ultimate aim of decarbonizing fully the building stock. So it was said that defined that for the national trajectory on residential buildings, there should be a reduction of primary energy use of at least 16% by 2030, and then 20 to 22% by 2035. But then it continues, and the continuation is then specified and defined by the national building renovation plans. So where member states, through these building renovation plans, have the flexibility how it is best calibrated. The calibration is also to be seen compared to the non-residential buildings, because together, basically, we have the whole impact. So there can be some priority setting, of course, that you do a bit more or a bit less on either residential or non-residential buildings. That's also for the member states to see. But for non-residential buildings, we have also such figures. That the instrument there is rather a minimum energy performance standard, which was chosen, not for the residential buildings, but for the non-residential buildings, leading to a renovation of 16% of the worst performing buildings by 2030 and 26% by 2033. But member states can exempt certain building categories. For instance, historic buildings where it's particularly difficult based on a cost-benefit assessment. But the exemptions would not lead basically to making a big hole in it and then doing nothing. Member states will need to make sure that overall they are on a reasonable pathway towards 2050, so that they will compensate also where they exempt certain buildings, that will have to compensate with other efforts basically across the building stock, that they will remain on a reasonable pathway to avoid basically that you would leave too many tasks to be done later on and forego opportunities basically in the shorter term. So it's to some extent a balancing act between, I would say, making reasonable progress, but subject to feasibility both in terms of what is possible from the budget side, but also from the capacity of the sector for both industry, but also the installers. The important thing is not to overdo it. I would say to overimpose and to put the ambition higher than the capacity is of the building sector, the absorption capacity, because we would rather have to see how we address the different bottlenecks, the barriers in a way which is also predictable, and that the barriers will be overcome as quickly as possible. For instance, through training young people, developing the skills in a certain sector, investments, financing coming in also from the private sector, so to stimulate and to empower and create incentives for the private financial institutions to bring in also their significant financing means, and that will have to be built up. What is very important to avoid is that there would be a kind of stop and go policy, a kind of overdoing it for some time, leading to a hayfire, to rising prices, and then a kind of run on certain things, and then after a while stop again, and everything drops to the bottom, and then a lot of frustration would be there with the economic operators, but also workers who would get possibly unemployed again. So continuity is, I think, the important thing in this sector. Continuity over time and predictability. And there, member states have a very large responsibility, and they need to consult also the building up of the national renovation plans with the stakeholders, the whole citizens and stakeholders, economic operators, but also especially the local authorities, as I would say the most important actors at the national level within the national framework.
Thank you, Stefan. So indeed, it provides a clear trajectory, and now member states will have to define their own way to go through it, and also consulting at national level. So Thomas, maybe you would like to comment on this, because it's a part that has been intensively discussed, and it is not exactly what was proposed by the Commission initially. It's not exactly what the Parliament wanted, but it's a good balance between all the interest to make it feasible. But Thomas, what's your opinion on this?
Yeah, I, as you correctly said, I think it's not where the Commission had started off, and certainly not where the Parliament went to. But again, these are the in terms of actual implementability. And Stefan, you'll remember when we were negotiating this, this was the question that we kept being asked: is how do I implement this? It was the implementability. So the reason we developed this sort of this approach was to give member states a degree of flexibility. Because when it comes to buildings, I do think there is an element, certainly even related to residential buildings, where there is an element of this is my home, this is where someone lives, and we're acutely aware of any narrative forming that this is Brussels telling you what to do with your home, and if you don't do it, we're going to evict everyone, which is, that narrative is nonsense, by the way. But you know, that's not something that we wanted to entertain. So I think the approach that we had gone for was more along the lines of flexibility for the member states, but also flexibility for homeowners and building owners in that regard.
Good. So we have a good trajectory for renovation with some flexibility for member states. Now I think we also have a trajectory for the deployment of solar energy in buildings and for the phasing out of fossil fuel. So Stefan, can you describe what is the trajectory on these 2 points?
Yeah. Solar energy is an obvious, I would say, contribution of the building sector to generate renewable energy. Not only to use energy, but to generate actively on space which otherwise would be largely unused by society. The challenge here is to make investments as reasonable as possible, because buildings should be solar ready. So new buildings is relatively straightforward, relatively easy. But again, for the existing buildings, the question is which buildings are solar ready in terms of stability, quality of the building, quality of the roof top area in particular, but also the exposure of the building. Is it in the shade? Is it in the right direction? Is there enough sun? Does it pay off to have solar panels installed? And if I say solar panels, it means both electricity, so PV, but also solar thermal. There's also an optimization to be made between the two in principle. So it's not just about solar PV, it's also about solar thermal. There are requirements in the text to install solar energy installations for new buildings, and also new roofed car parks, and existing public and non-residential buildings based on trigger points. So trigger points would be a major renovation or a permit, so that the responsible authorities would get the building on their desk and basically then also have a handle to somehow contribute to the decision making, whether it's useful to have solar installations on that roof. And the criterion is basically the feasibility in technical, economic, and functional terms. Does it make sense, basically, to do this? So that is a very important provision. Then, in terms of zero on-site emissions, as mentioned before, new buildings basically should have no fossil fuels on-site from 2028, and all buildings from 2030 when they're new. There should be a progressive phase out of fossil fuel use in buildings. So not actively subsidize any more standalone boilers powered by fossil fuels as of beginning of next year, 2025. Standalone is explicitly mentioned in the legal text. So that means that combined systems, hybrid systems, could still be subsidized because they make sense for the transition. So it's very important to organize the transition in a smooth manner, that there would not be a kind of abrupt stop, basically, to what can be address basically what can be used in certain types of buildings. So there can be a very reasonable introduction in a gradual manner of renewable energy in existing building systems. So as a combination, as an add-on, for instance, as a renewable energy source. And that can be still subsidized as of next year and continue also. And there, of course, the question is always, how do we optimize the heating or cooling system for an existing building? What is most reasonable and for both from both the renewable energy point of view or sustainability point of view, but also from what the building requires in terms of functionality and how much heat would have to be generated. There's also a clear legal basis for member states in the directive to set requirements for the heating and cooling systems based on greenhouse gas emissions, type of fuel, or minimum share of renewable energy used for heating and cooling. That was an issue which was to some extent not entirely clear until that was clarified in the directive, because to some extent it could be challenged on the basis of possibly the internal market, if basically appliances which are legally on the market can be put in a building or not. But the directive says, yes, member states on their territory can set requirements based on the performance of those appliances. So greenhouse gas emissions, type of fuel, or minimum share of renewable energy used for heating and cooling. And then overall, member states should set out measures in their building renovation plans, but also more broadly in their policies, to phase out fossil fuels in heating and cooling over time, and with a view, so aspirational, with a view to complete phase out of boilers powered by fossil fuels by 2040. That means it's a date for the overall measures, for the overall national policies and measures. It would not mean that if one or the other boiler remains in the building stock by 2040, it would be illegal. So that certainly not. But overall policy should be set to complete the phase out of fossil fuel boilers by 2040. So, and that I think is the system foreseen under this directive, as I just said it. Thank you.
Yeah. And again, I think it provides a clear trajectory, and it allows to organize many things for it. So switching to alternative systems, which can be district heating, can be heat pumps, and you need to anticipate a few things for this, for sure. So that's important again. So thank you, Stefan. So there are many other things in the buildings directive. So even going beyond purely energy, one of these is sustainable mobility. So there we had already requirements in the past for charging points for electric vehicles, and now in sustainable mobility there are also elements for cycling parks. So can you tell a bit more about what is covered for sustainable mobility, Stefan?
Thanks a lot, Quentin. So indeed, that is, I would say, a case of making concrete system integration between the building sector and mobility, which go hand in hand. Buildings provide the space for charging and recharging mobility, cars, bikes, all forms of mobility, together with the public space, where we have a separate legal framework, the Alternative Fuel Infrastructure Regulation. So the Epbd, the Buildings Directive, and the Alternative Fuel Infrastructure Regulation work together, public space and basically the space in or adjacent to buildings, which is covered by the Epbd. So the idea is really to make sure that there will be enough recharging points in the various buildings which we have, or around, adjacent to those buildings, and to find also the right balance here. So there was a choice to be made between pre-cabling and ducting. So to go basically gradually up in terms of number and overall capacity, but also leave open some space for technological improvements and developments over time, to keep some flexibility also how much is needed, and to leave basically further scaling up for later where needed. So that was the issue between pre-cabling and ducting. Pre-cabling has the advantage of having it basically available immediately once you complete the works. And ducting leaves more flexibility in terms of how strong the cable is, what precisely is needed in terms of recharging technology, and would possibly then also leave more time for the entire investment, so that not everything has to be done at the same time. So there are basically the norm is pre-cabling and ducting for new and renovated buildings. There is, I would say, a certain distribution between pre-cabling and ducting, for instance, 50% versus 50%. Then there's also a provision on the minimum number of recharging points in new residential and non-residential buildings and large existing non-residential buildings. And very importantly, member states need to simplify and streamline and accelerate the procedure for the installation of recharging points. There should also be enabling of smart charging and also, where appropriate, bi-directional charging. And on bike parking spaces, including cargo bikes, there should be a minimum number, or there's a minimum number of those places in new and renovated buildings, and also in existing large non-residential buildings. So that is what I would say a case of application of trying to find the right balance for the individual components and aspects. Of course, member states can always go further. It's a directive which basically sets rather minimum requirements, but member states can do more if that is useful for the territory, in consultation with the citizens and the sector. But overall, there would be I would say, a kind of reasonable push forward from the European level towards all member states, so that the situation becomes clearly improved for sustainable mobility across the entire Union.
Thank you, Stefan. So also an important chapter of this directive. So yeah, we see there is really a lot in this directive, and today we only have 1 hour, and I see we have many questions coming. So I would like also to have time for this later. But before that, going through the framework, I think it's important to highlight that we have trajectories, we have requirements, but there are also a lot of things to enable this, to support this. So with different tools, with different support instruments, and also some social safeguards. So Stefan, could you highlight a few key elements of this for the understanding of everyone today?
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Quentin. So tools, as you just mentioned, is basically the quality of information. So we have still the challenge that member states do not, at least not equally, know precisely what the quality of their building stock is, and so that they can prioritize, that they can basically identify the buildings most in need of a renovation. So it's basically to enable the diagnosis of where do we need to start, what is the benefit of renovating, how much energy do we save when renovating certain types of buildings, or even individual buildings. So if it's important ones, then you can even look at an individual building level, and at the municipal level, for instance, you have an understanding what are your public buildings, for instance. But when it comes to the large number of buildings, then one would rely on certain tools like the energy performance certificate, which puts together basically the relevant information. And there, the idea of the directive is to improve the quality of what is written, basically what is contained in those energy performance certificates, and that member states would make sure that there's a reasonable distribution of the classes across the building stock, that there would not be a kind of too strong concentration in a certain part of the scale, that there would be a scale from A to G, and across that scale there would be a reasonable distribution, that you can set priorities clearly, and that is something which will need to be improved in a number of member states compared to the system which is now in place. The renovation passports is a tool to facilitate renovations, also deep renovations over time, because renovations to make a building, basically a zero-emission building by 2050, will require a number of interventions. And of course, this can be done in one go, but in many ways, this might overwhelm or simply make it impossible for the owners, for the inhabitants, for the users of the building to be carried out in one go. So then, therefore, they can be stretched over time, but in compatible steps and seen as a package, basically, but implemented step by step in a journey, basically, like walking on a very high mountain. Yeah? You don't do it in one day; you do it in several days, and you have pauses and breaks in between to recover but to set the priorities right from the start. What do we need to do? How much do we need to have in terms of financing, for instance, at a particular moment? And what would be the most obvious first priority to be tackled in the building, and what can come later on? It would also depend on the age, on the performance of individual components of the building, where basically intervention is most needed. For instance, the facade, because it's very poorly insulated, or the heating system, or the roof. So to set priorities with this renovation passport. And the building renovation plans, I would say, are the most important planning tool for the member states, but also to create this common understanding, this reference framework, which everyone accepts to be a reliable basis for making investments, for improving and scaling up training opportunities, steering basically the choice of professions, even for young people, what is needed, where do we have bottlenecks, where there's maybe not so much a need to go into, and so on. So, and of course, this will have to be always revisited. So the building renovation plans will have to be updated every several years in order to make sure that we are still we're still up to date, and that the information is still relevant, because of course the future is uncertain. No one knows exactly what will happen, and there will have to be a need to revisit certain parts in a I would say in a intensive consultation. So it's important it doesn't just get imposed from the capital top down, but rather built up bottom up, with knowledge integrated from the decision makers at the local level, but also the economic operators, industry, installers. Where are the problems which they're facing? So that is the tool, basically the overall tool to address the barriers which are there. Also to have some predictability on financing and planning, how much money is needed from the public side, but also how much private money has to come in. And this is also the strategic framework for, I would say, identifying the support mechanisms, technical support, the one-stop shops, as an idea that you would have low barrier places to go to, either physically, I would say, but actually also and virtually. So there would always be online information, but also personal advice from advisors, even coming home and visiting the building to have targeted advice. But of course, this can also be done in virtual ways, really up to the member states to organize that. So to optimize that and define also how much money would have to be coming in. The funding is to be seen as investments, really. I would say it's not a kind of social transfer or something which would be a kind of lost money. It is usually money which pays off, which avoids future costs, notably high energy bills. So it's an investment, and I think the important challenge is to see where the investment pays off the most, to prioritize that, and that is often the worst performing buildings. To see also how much money is needed for the for the vulnerable people living in those buildings to be able to go along, to avoid that they would not have to leave the building. Basically, that comes then to the issue of social safeguards. protection of tenants, that they would contribute to covering the investments to the extent that they actually benefit financially from that. But of course, in terms of social living conditions, if they improve, but if otherwise they could not afford, it would be a kind of, to some extent, society investment in vulnerable parts of the population, which would have to be covered by basically a public interest consideration. So because vulnerable people cannot pay for, I would say, the improvements of the quality of living in the worst performing buildings. It's rather a benefit for society. There would be better integration of vulnerable parts of the population. And that, I think, is also something which should be openly discussed throughout society when establishing the building renovation plans, that there would be also consensus that it's reasonable and beneficial for everyone, that people would be empowered and have an improvement to their living conditions, improve social integration, basically also.
Thank you, Stefan. So indeed, various elements that are very important. There are several provisions related to social safeguards, and I know it is quite important for the Parliament as well. Aware of the time now, I suggest we stop here with the overview of the directive. I will still mention that there are some other provisions related to smart readiness of buildings, also to wall-life carbon, which is a new element that we have discussed already in this academy. Smart readiness, we will organize a dedicated webinar in a few weeks. Also some provisions related to indoor environmental quality. So there are a lot of things into the directive. Now the text of this provisional agreement is available on the website of the Parliament and the Council. If you cannot find it easily, you can check my LinkedIn profile. I have posted it there as well. And in a few weeks, it will be submitted to vote in the plenary of the European Parliament, and will also be formally approved by the Council, and then it will be finally published in the official journal and enter into force normally in a few weeks or months, and then member states will have to implement it. So that's for the next steps in a nutshell. So thank you, Thomas and Stefan, for this first overview. And now we will stop the recording and we will move to the questions that we have received.